Inside the closed plantation files of Mecklenburg County, Virginia, one book stands out from all the rest, written in fast handwriting across 3 separate pages dated March 1848. It writes down something that went against even the cruel logic of slavery itself. A woman listed as property who had given birth to 11 children over 27 years. Each child was fathered by a different generation of the same family. The county official who found these records in 1847 while trying to settle the estate reportedly refused to finish his job and quit his post without giving a reason. What he found in those pages, in the careful notes of births and sales, and in the edges filled with excuses and erased marks, showed a planned horror of the system. The family involved had kept detailed records as if they were writing down a science experiment. Before we go on with the story of what happened on the Strathmore Plantation, I need to ask you to subscribe to this channel and press the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And please leave a comment telling us what state or city you are watching from. We love knowing where our listeners are. What those records showed would force a whole county to face a question they never wanted to ask. What happens when the system of slavery is used not just with casual cruelty, but with a calculated plan across generations? The Strathmore Plantation covered 1,100 acres along the Roanoke River, in an area where Virginia's rolling hills turned into flat tobacco country. By 1821, when our story starts, Mecklenburg County had become one of the state's most productive areas for growing tobacco. Its money depended entirely on enslaved workers. The Strathmore family, led then by Colonel Edmund Strathmore, represented the county's established upper class, not the richest planters, but not the poorest either. They owned 43 enslaved people, kept a modest but nice main house, and were known locally for following what they called scientific management of their property. Edmund Strathmore had received the land from his father in 1815, along with a lot of debt from the tobacco price drops that happened after the War of 1812. A soldier from that war, Edmund had come home with ideas about efficiency and keeping records learned from his time as a supply officer. He used military exactness to manage the plantation. Detailed books tracked every part of production, from pounds of tobacco cured to the birth dates and family lines of every enslaved person. His wife Catherine had died in 1820 while giving birth to their only living child, a son named Lawrence, leaving Edmund to raise the boy by himself. Among the enslaved people Edmund received was a girl named Harriet, born on the farm in 1808. The records describe her as mixed race. By 1821, at 13 years old, she worked in the main house as a servant. This job took her away from the hard field work that killed so many, but put her close to the family in ways that would turn out to be important. The household in those years included Edmund, the widowed colonel in his early 40s, young Lawrence, barely 8 years old, and a small staff that ran the main house. Edmund's brother Thomas lived in a separate house on the land with his own family, managing much of the day-to-day farm work. The social world of Mecklenburg County at this time was defined by a strict code of honor among the planter class, one that demanded good behavior in public while allowing private sins that remained purposely ignored. The county seat, Boyton, was 7 miles away, far enough that the plantations ran like their own little worlds, their private business rarely looked at by outsiders. Local church leaders visited sometimes, and nearby planters hung out during harvest festivals and Christmas parties, but the daily truths of plantation life remained mostly invisible to any real checks. The laws of Virginia slavery gave enslavers almost total power over those they held in chains, and interfering in plantation management was seen as violating property rights. It was into this isolated world, ruled by the total power of white men over black bodies, that the events began to happen. What made the Strathmore case different was not that sexual abuse happened, which was sadly common, but the way it was organized across generations and written down with the same clinical care Edmund used for his tobacco crops and animal breeding. The first note appears in Edmund Strathmore's private book in January 1822. Unlike the plantation's main record books, which tracked births, deaths, and sales in simple lists, this private journal had more detailed notes written in Edmund's neat hand. Harriet gave birth to a daughter, healthy, light-skinned, named Ruth, to be raised in the house. The note included no father's name, a purposeful missing detail in a book that carefully recorded the parents of every other child born on the plantation for breeding and value reasons. Harriet was 14 years old. The way the household worked changed slightly after Ruth's birth. Harriet stayed in the main house, now with a baby daughter who slept in a small room off the kitchen. Edmund's sister-in-law, Martha, who sometimes visited from Thomas's house, later wrote in a letter to family in Richmond that she found the setup strange but not wrong. As Edmund shows Christian kindness in keeping the girl from field work, despite her condition, the language was careful and coded, showing the same choice to look away that defined how the planter class talked about such things. Over the next 5 years, 3 more children appeared in Edmund's books: Sarah in 1824, Mary in 1826, and a son named Thomas in 1828, all listed as born to Harriet, all described as bright mixed race, all with no father listed. Each birth followed the same path. Harriet would disappear from the house for several days, returning with a newborn who would be fit in somehow in the already crowded servants' rooms. The other enslaved people on the farm understood what these missing details meant, but their knowledge lived in a place beyond official recognition, beyond the protection of any law or custom that might stop it. Young Lawrence Strathmore was growing up during these years, changing from a child to a teenager. Edmund, acting as both father and plantation master, taught his son the ways of managing human property. They walked the fields together. Edmund explained the difficulties of growing tobacco, figuring out how much work was needed, and keeping discipline. Lawrence learned to ride, to shoot, to give orders. And he learned through daily watching the unspoken rules that controlled the relationship between enslaved women and the men who held power over them. The first sign of what would become a pattern across generations appeared in Edmund's book in 1835. Lawrence was now 22, recently back from a short time at the College of William and Mary, which he had left after 2 years without finishing a degree. That spring, the book recorded, Harriet gave birth to a son, Marcus, healthy. Father, Lawrence Strathmore. Unlike the notes before, this one included the father's name, and the note seemed almost proud, as if admitting a tradition was being passed down. Harriet was 27 years old. She had been having children since she was 14, and now the pattern had moved to the next generation. What the book didn't say was whether she had any choice, whether she felt these events were attacks or had found some way to survive by accepting them, or whether the children she carried were wanted or just unavoidable. The documents kept facts but erased humanity. Including Lawrence's name meant something more planned than the usual silence around such things. Edmund had chosen to write down his son's actions, to make a record that linked the generations clearly. It suggested a plan, a choice that went beyond a single sin into something more organized. By 1840, the Strathmore plantation had turned into what Edmund thought was a perfect model of management. His books showed more profit, not from more land or better tobacco types, but from what he called natural increase. This meant the birth of enslaved children who added to his property value. Harriet's children, now ranging from baby Marcus to 18-year-old Ruth, were big assets in these numbers. But the human cost of this efficiency was becoming harder to hide, even within the closed world of the farm. Harriet had given birth to 9 children by 1840, 4 to Edmund in her teenage years, and 5 more to Lawrence between 1835 and 1840. The physical toll was clear to everyone who saw her. A traveling Methodist preacher who visited Strathmore in 1839, invited to lead services for the enslaved people, noted in his diary that one of the house servants looked worn out beyond her years, moving with pain, yet taking care of children who seemed to span an impossible age range for one. Mother, the preacher's note pointed out something the official records hid. Harriet was 32 years old and had spent nearly 20 years constantly having children. The children themselves lived in an unclear space in the plantation order, clearly mixed race, obviously related to the Strathmore men, yet still enslaved. Ruth, the oldest, worked next to her mother in the main house. The younger children helped in various ways, tending chickens, carrying water, running messages between the buildings. Edmund's health began to fail in early 1841. At 61, he suffered from breathing problems, likely made worse by decades of tobacco dust. As he got worse, he spent more time in his office, obsessively organizing his papers and books. His brother Thomas, who had managed much of the daily farm work for years, took more visible control, but what to do with the property, including the enslaved people, remained Edmund's choice. Lawrence, now 28, had married a woman named Elizabeth Mercer from a nearby county in 1839. She moved into the Strathmore main house, and the presence of a white mistress changed how the house ran. Elizabeth certainly noticed Harriet and her children, especially Marcus, who at 6 years old looked very much like her husband. The history books have no direct proof of Elizabeth's thoughts, but letters from her sister suggest she found plantation life hard on her Christian feelings and spent much time visiting relatives. During Edmund's final sickness in late 1841, he made plans that showed the full size of his calculations. His will, written with the help of a lawyer from Boydton, gave away his property in great detail. The enslaved people were split among family members, with most going to Lawrence as the main heir, but specific rules addressed Harriet and her children. They were to stay together, assigned to Lawrence, with the note that these individuals represent valuable property whose separation would lower their total worth. Edmund Strathmore died in December 1841, leaving Lawrence as master of the plantation. The change of power was smooth. Lawrence had been trained for this role his whole life. He continued his father's management styles, kept the detailed books, and kept the organized writing that Edmund had started, and he continued the pattern his father had begun with Harriet. The 1840s brought big changes to Virginia's money situation. Tobacco prices went up and down wildly, and many Mecklenburg County planters began switching to growing wheat or selling enslaved people to the growing cotton plantations of the Deep South. The Strathmore plantation under Lawrence's rule followed a different plan. Heavy use of its existing workers paired with the natural increase that Edmund had focused on. Harriet bore 3 more children between 1842 and 1845, all written down as fathered by Lawrence. The births came with more difficulty. At 34, then 36, then 37, her body showed the built-up damage of constant pregnancy and childbirth. A letter from Thomas Strathmore to a business partner in Richmond, dated May 1008, 145, mentioned quickly that my nephew works his people hard, perhaps too hard, but the crops remain strong. The phrase works his people hard had many meanings in slavery, and Thomas's choice of words suggested he knew of something beyond normal work abuse. But whatever worries he might have had stayed private. The Strathmore family kept its name as respectable planters, regular churchgoers, and proper citizens of the county. Lawrence's son, Edmund, was born to Elizabeth in 1043, named for his grandfather. The boy grew up in the main house, cared for by enslaved servants, including some of Harriet's older daughters. The difference was sharp. The white child, heir to the plantation, being dressed and fed by his own half-sisters, enslaved and unacknowledged. This was not rare in plantation houses, but the Strathmore situation had an extra layer of complexity given the planned and documented nature of the relationships. By 1847, Harriet had given birth to 12 children across 26 years. The oldest, Ruth, was now 25 and had herself given birth to 2 children, adding to the farm's enslaved population. The younger children ranged down to the baby born in 1845. Harriet herself was 39, aged beyond her years, increasingly stuck with lighter duties as her health failed. It was during this time that cracks began to show in the careful records Edmund had started. Lawrence's book entries became more spotty, with gaps appearing in the usually perfect records. A note from March 1847 reads simply, "Harriet unwell attended by Thomas's wife Martha. Recovery unsure. No details, no sickness name, just a note that something had changed." The spring of 1847 brought another event that would prove important. Young Edmund Strathmore, now 4 years old, showed an early smartness that made his father happy. Lawrence began including the boy in tours of the farm, much as Edmund Sr. had done with Lawrence decades earlier. The child was learning the family business, being shaped into the next generation of masters. During one such tour in April 1847, written in Lawrence's diary, Edmund asked his father about the children who worked around the main house. "Why do they all look like each other?" the boy asked, his child's eyes seeing what adults had learned to ignore. Lawrence's written answer was vague. "They are family from the same mother. That is how things work here." The talk showed how normal the situation had become. Young Edmund was being taught to see enslaved people as property, their relationships and origins not mattering beyond their use. But something in that talk seems to have bothered Lawrence, judging by notes in the following weeks. He wrote more often about proper management, about keeping order, about the duties of our position. The language suggested a man trying to justify something to frame it within acceptable moral ideas. He increased the number of religious services for the enslaved people, bringing in preachers to stress obeying and submitting as Christian virtues. The summer of 1847 was terribly hot, even for Virginia. Tobacco crops suffered, and several enslaved people collapsed from heat stroke in the fields. Lawrence became increasingly worried about money. Crop failures meant less money, and he had borrowed against future crops to pay for growth. The pressures of running the farm weighed heavily, and his private writings from this time show a man struggling to keep control. Harriet's health had not gotten better since the spring. She was now mostly stuck in her small room, able to do only tiny jobs. Martha Strathmore, Thomas's wife, helped her sometimes, giving herbal medicines and what passed for medical care in that world. A letter from Martha to her sister in Petersburg, dated July 1847, gave a rare look into the situation. I care for a woman who has suffered too much, though no one speaks of it directly. She bears it with a dignity that shames those responsible, yet I am powerless to step in on matters not my own. The letter was as close as anyone came to admitting the truth of Harriet's situation. But Martha, like all women in the planter class, lived within limits that restricted her power. She could offer private help, but not public challenge. The system protected itself through layers of involvement and silence. In August 1847, an event happened that broke the plantation's careful order. Marcus, Harriet's son by Lawrence, now 12 years old, was caught trying to leave the farm. He had taken food and a blanket, heading north along a path that suggested he had learned something about the underground railroad networks that existed even in Virginia. He was caught within hours, brought back to the plantation, and locked in a shed for 3 days. The usual punishment for such an escape attempt would have been severe whipping, public shame, and possible sale, but Lawrence instead chose a different response. He wrote down the event carefully in his book, noted Marcus's age and parents, and then did nothing. The boy was returned to his duties without physical punishment, a strange thing that suggested Lawrence was planning something beyond immediate discipline. That same month, Elizabeth Strathmore left the plantation, taking young Edmund with her to stay with her parents in Halifax County. The official reason was that she wanted relief from the summer heat and wanted to visit family, but the timing immediately following Marcus' escape attempt suggested other reasons. A letter she wrote to her sister, found years later, gave context. I can no longer stay in a house where sins of the fathers visit children who have their faces yet are treated like cattle. My husband speaks of duty and management, but I see only purposeful cruelty wrapped in book columns. Elizabeth would not return to Strathmore Plantation. She and Lawrence would remain married but separated. Young Edmund spent most of his time with his mother's family. This setup, while odd, was not unheard of in Virginia society. Marriages existed on paper while couples lived apart, keeping up appearances while admitting private problems. The events of October 1847 would finally show what the Strathmore family had carefully written down, but never publicly admitted. A traveling county official named Samuel Pritchard arrived at the plantation to do a routine check of property values for tax reasons. This was normal practice, requiring a look at land, buildings, tools, and enslaved people. What made this check different was Pritchard's care. He had a reputation for total accuracy and insisted on reviewing all relevant papers. Pritchard was 43 years old, born in Petersburg, who had built his career on a name for honesty in a job often ruined by favoritism and bribes. He arrived at Strathmore on October 12th, carrying the leather bag that held his forms and measuring tools. Lawrence greeted him politely, offering food and a room in the main house for the time of his work. It was standard hospitality, and Lawrence showed no worry about the check. Why would he? The records were perfect, the property well kept, everything written down with the exactness his father had taught. The first day passed normally. Pritchard measured fields, looked at tobacco supplies, checked the condition of buildings and tools. He spoke with Thomas Strathmore about crop amounts and with the manager about animals. By evening, he had finished the physical check and asked to see the plantation books to verify his numbers against the written property values. Lawrence gave the books willingly, even proudly. His father's record keeping was legendary in the county, and Lawrence had kept the same standards. He showed Pritchard to the office, a wood-paneled room lined with shelves holding decades of ledgers, journals, and letters. The documents were organized by date, each spine labeled with dates in neat handwriting. Lawrence left Pritchard to work, returning to his own duties, sure that the check would confirm Strathmore's standing as a well-managed property. Pritchard began with the current year's book, working backward to find patterns of work and property growth. The entries were indeed impressive in their detail. Every bushel of tobacco, every pound of pork, every birth and death among the enslaved people, all recorded with care. He made notes, figured values, checked numbers. Standard work, though unusually pleasant given the quality of the writing. It was while looking at the birth lists that Pritchard first noticed something strange. The enslaved population showed steady growth through natural increase, which was common enough, but one woman's name appeared with shocking frequency. Harriet, no last name, born 1808, listed as house servant. Between 1822 and 1845, she had given birth to 12 children, an amazingly high number, even by plantation standards, where enslaved women were often forced into constant childbearing. What caught Pritchard's attention more than the number was the note pattern. Most births in the book included some sign of the father, useful for tracking bloodlines and stopping inbreeding, which planters feared would lower property values. But Harriet's earlier children, Ruth, Sarah, Mary, Thomas, had no father listed, just blank spaces where names should be. Then, starting in 1835, the pattern changed. 5 straight births listed Father Lawrence Strathmore in the same hand that made the other notes. Pritchard paused, pen hanging over his notes. The clear admission of being the father by the plantation owner was unusual, not unheard of. Some planters did claim their children by enslaved women, sometimes even freeing them, but the organized writing suggested something beyond single incidents. He flipped back through earlier books, tracing Harriet's notes backward. The 1821-1830 book was in different handwriting, Edmund Strathmore's based on the signature on the inside cover. Here, Pritchard found more notes for Harriet's children, the earliest dated January 1822, when Harriet would have been 14. Harriet gave birth to a daughter, healthy, light-skinned, named Ruth, to be raised in the house, still no father listed. 3 more births through 1828, same pattern, detailed notes about the children. Purposeful gaps about the father. A suspicion was forming in Pritchard's mind, disturbing enough that he tried to push it away as a mean guess. Perhaps the fathers were unknown, different enslaved men whose names weren't recorded because they didn't affect property lines. Perhaps Harriet had been hired out to nearby farms and returned pregnant. There were innocent reasons, and Pritchard, by nature and job, liked written facts over guesses. But then he found Edmund Strathmore's private journals kept separately from the business books. These were personal records, not meant for county clerks or outside eyes. Lawrence had apparently included them without checking what was inside, assuming they were simply more plantation records of the type his father kept. Pritchard opened the first journal dated 1008, 120-1008, 125. The notes mixed plantation business with personal thoughts, observations about tobacco, growing alongside notes about the weather, local politics, social visits, and scattered through these pages in the same measured hand that recorded crop yields were notes about Harriet. January 1008, 122. Harriet has proven good at household duties. She shows smarts beyond her station and has learned tasks quickly. Catherine's death leaves the house without proper female management, and the girl's help becomes increasingly valuable. The note was boring, an employer checking a servant, but then, several pages later, March 1008, 122, the situation with Harriet has developed beyond initial plans. I have allowed myself freedoms that, while legally okay, trouble my conscience when thought about in daylight hours. Yet the needs of plantation management require certain accommodations. Pritchard felt his stomach tighten. The language was careful, coded, but the meaning was clear. He continued reading, finding more such notes. Edmund Strathmore had written down not just the children born, but his own actions leading to their creation. The journal became a story of ongoing abuse described in words that mixed self-excuse with occasional glimpses of guilt quickly pushed away. June 1824, Sarah born to Harriet. The child appears healthy and will prove valuable in time. I tell myself this arrangement serves multiple purposes: domestic peace in the absence of a wife and natural increase to the property holdings. Other men keep such arrangements openly. I merely do so with greater privacy. The reasoning was circular, defensive, a man arguing with himself and losing. By the time Pritchard reached Edmund's notes from the early 1830s, the tone had shifted from excuse to something more planned. October 1834. Lawrence returns from college next month. At 21, he must begin understanding all parts of plantation management. The boy has led a sheltered life, influenced too much by his mother's relatives and their soft views. He must learn that good management sometimes requires decisions that seem harsh to outsiders, but are necessary for keeping order and work. I have decided to teach him in practical matters, including those arrangements which, while not discussed in polite company, form part of the plantation economy. Pritchard set down the journal and walked to the window, needing to clear his head. Outside, enslaved people moved through their evening tasks, carrying water, tending fires, finishing jobs before darkness fell completely. The scene appeared normal, the kind of plantation view visible across Virginia. But the papers in this room revealed something underneath that normal surface, a system of abuse so thoroughly normalized that it could be recorded in the same books that track tobacco yields described with the same clinical language applied to animal breeding. He returned to the desk and continued reading, forced now by a need to understand the full size of what Edmund had written. The notes from 1835-1840 showed Edmund purposely involving Lawrence in plantation management, including what he called household arrangements. There were no graphic descriptions, but the progress was clear. Edmund introducing his son to practices he himself had started, treating Harriet's systematic abuse as part of Lawrence's education in being a master. March 1835. Lawrence has begun to understand the full range of his power and duties. He shows initial hesitation influenced by romantic ideas picked up at college, but I see this fading as real experience replaces abstract ideals. The boy will make a proper planter. The pride in Edmund's words was chilling. Pride not just in his son's growth, but in the specific understanding being passed down. The journal recorded Lawrence's first child with Harriet, born later that same year. Edmund's note mentioned it almost casually. Harriet gave birth to a son, Marcus, admitted as Lawrence's. The pattern continues to the next generation, as I planned. This organized approach to natural increase, combined with careful record keeping, represents a model that other plantations might benefit from studying, though the topic remains unfit for public talk. Pritchard realized he was reading a confession, not framed as one, not written with any sense of wrong, but a confession nonetheless. Edmund Strathmore had not stumbled into using Harriet. He had planned it, continued it across decades, and purposely passed the practice to his son. The writing wasn't accidental. It was part of the system itself, a record of what Edmund apparently viewed as new plantation management. The later journals, now in Lawrence's hand, continued the pattern. His notes lacked his father's deep thoughts, being more purely business-like, but they confirmed the continuation of everything Edmund had started. Births were recorded, the children's growth noted in terms of their future work value, and the entire setup treated as simply one more part of property management. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in these records grows. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next. Pritchard found himself reading faster now, driven by a need to reach the end, to see if there was any admitting of wrong, any moment where either man admitted the humanity they were systematically hurting. But there was nothing. The journals ended in early 147, with Lawrence's notes mentioning Harriet's failing health in the same tone one might describe a workhorse going lame. Sad from a property standpoint, but not a moral crisis. It was getting close to midnight when Pritchard finally closed the last journal. He sat in silence for long minutes trying to organize his thoughts. What he had read was legally allowed. Virginia law gave enslavers total power over enslaved people, including rights that extended to sexual access. Courts had consistently ruled that enslaved people could not speak against white people, could not refuse orders, had no right to body ownership. Everything Edmund and Lawrence had done was protected by law. But the organized nature of it, the writing, the purposeful generational continuation, this felt different. This wasn't casual abuse, but planned harm recorded with the pride of new ideas. And the records themselves were now in Pritchard's hands, having been offered to him as normal business papers. What was his duty? What was his power? What would even be the right action in the face of legally protected horror? He spent a troubled night in the Strathmore guest room, sleep broken by pieces of what he'd read. The next morning, he asked for more papers from Lawrence, needing to finish his assessment, but also wanting to check what he'd discovered. Lawrence gave everything asked for, still showing no knowledge of what the records revealed. To him, they were simply thorough bookkeeping, the kind his father had taught him to keep. Pritchard spent the entire second day cross-referencing the journals against the property books, building a complete timeline. The writing was indeed complete. He could trace not just Harriet's children, but their assignments to various tasks as they aged, their values for insurance reasons, their roles in the plantation economy. Ruth, the oldest, was valued at $800 by age 18, listed as an experienced house servant. The younger children had increasing values as they approached working age. The entire family, created through organized rape across 2 generations, was calculated as part of the plantation's worth. He also found letters between Edmund and other planters discussing natural increase as an investment plan. A letter from 1837, filed with business papers, included Edmund's advice to a neighbor. The key is careful attention to the matter, treating it as one would any breeding program with careful choice and consistent application. Writing proves essential both for insurance reasons and for tracking improvements in stock quality. The language made Pritchard physically sick. Breeding program, stock quality, terms applied to human beings. On the third day, Pritchard told Lawrence that he needed to return to Boynton to finish his report, but would file more papers regarding unusual circumstances requiring commissioner review. Lawrence seemed puzzled, but not alarmed. He assumed this was some technical requirement related to property value complexity. He offered Pritchard use of a horse and thanked him for his thoroughness. The ride back to Boynton gave Pritchard time to think. He carried in his bag not just his assessment forms, but pages of notes documenting what he'd found, along with dates and ledger references to support his report. But what exactly would he report? That a planter had written down doing what countless other planters did without writing it down. That slavery included sexual abuse. A fact everyone already knew, but nobody discussed that the legal system explicitly allowed what moral feelings condemned. He wrote his report that evening in his Boydton office, writing and rewriting, trying to find language that would show the situation's seriousness without seeming wild or overstepping his power. The final version included his standard property check. Fields, buildings, enslaved people, tools, all valued according to standard rules. But attached was a separate document marked Private Concerns requiring commissioner attention. In this attachment, Pritchard detailed what he'd found. The organized pattern spanning 27 years, the writing of purposeful generational continuation, the clear admission in the journals of treating Harriet as property to be used across decades. He carefully listed ledger pages and dates, providing proof for every claim. His ending was carefully worded. The records show practices that, while legally allowed, raise questions regarding estate settlement issues, possible fights over property status of certain individuals, and writing that might prove problematic should legal rules regarding slavery undergo future change. The language was deliberately bureaucratic, framing moral horror as office complexity. Pritchard knew he couldn't challenge slavery itself. His job didn't allow such scope, and Virginia society wouldn't accept it. But perhaps he could create a record that might matter later, writing that proved someone had noticed, had objected, had tried to make the truth official, even if no action followed. He handed in the report to Commissioner Josiah H. Ricks on October 18, 1847. H. Ricks read it while Pritchard watched, his face growing darker as he read through the attachment. When he finished, he sat in silence for nearly a minute before speaking. "This is detailed." H. Ricks finally said, "You're sure of these facts? Everything is written in the Strathmore books." Pritchard replied, "The journals are clear." Edmund Strathmore described his actions and intentions clearly, and Lawrence continued the pattern. H. Ricks shuffled the papers uncomfortably. "You understand this presents difficulties. The Strathmores are an established family. What you describe, while disturbing, isn't illegal. Many plantations involve similar situations, though most have the sense not to write them down so thoroughly." "That's exactly my point, Commissioner. The writing exists. Should these records ever become relevant to legal cases, estate fights, property settlements, future changes in legal status, they could complicate matters largely, and you believe such issues are likely." Pritchard chose his words carefully. "I believe thorough writing sometimes reveals things that remain invisible when unwritten. Whether that writing should be ignored or addressed isn't my decision to make, but as county clerk, I cannot complete a property check and simply file away records that explicitly describe systematic." He paused, searching for acceptable language, use of property in ways that blur legal categories. H. Ricks understood the coded language. Pritchard was saying the records revealed Harriet's children were both property and family, enslaved and blood relatives, their status unclear in ways that could create legal tangles. He was also saying something remained deeply wrong, even if the law allowed it. "What are you asking I do?" H. Ricks asked. "Investigate, talk to the parties involved, create an official record of findings, at minimum document that county authorities were aware of the situation should questions arise later." H. Ricks considered this. The request was reasonable from a procedure standpoint, even if moved by moral worries. But investigating the Strathmore plantation meant potentially exposing practices that occurred throughout the county. It meant forcing planters to confront officially what they preferred to ignore publicly. It meant risking social and political backlash from the very class that controlled county government. "I'll need time to think about how to proceed," H. Ricks said finally. Leave the documents with me. I'll review them thoroughly and decide what, if any, action is right. Pritchard left the commissioner's office knowing that time to consider likely meant time to find a way to bury this. But he had done what he could within his power. The writing now existed in official county records filed with a government office available to anyone who might someday look for it. Over the following days, Pritchard waited for some response from H. Shricks. None came. He asked quiet questions and learned the commissioner had talked with the county lawyer, who advised that no legal laws had been broken, and therefore no investigation was needed. The Strathmore records were filed as part of the routine tax check. The attachment marked reviewed, no action required. A week after his first report, Pritchard received a call to H. Shricks's office. He arrived to find not just the commissioner, but also Lawrence Strathmore and the county lawyer, Benjamin Hayes. The air was tense. Mr. Pritchard, Hayes began formally. We've reviewed your report regarding the Strathmore property check. While we appreciate your thoroughness, there are worries about your view of standard plantation records and your description of legally allowed property management as somehow wrong. Pritchard felt his anger rising but kept his voice level. I described nothing. I wrote down what the records themselves state clearly. You wrote down your view. Hayes interrupted. You've taken standard business records and framed them in language suggesting wrongdoing where none exists legally. This constitutes going over your power as an assessor. Lawrence Strathmore spoke for the first time, his voice carrying real confusion rather than anger. Mr. Pritchard, I don't understand your objection. The records my father kept and I maintain document property management. They're unusually detailed, certainly, but that's a good thing, not a fault. What exactly do you claim I've done wrong? The question hung in the air. Pritchard realized Lawrence truly didn't understand. He'd been raised in a system that normalized total power over enslaved people. Educated by a father who treated organized sexual abuse as property management, surrounded by a society that legally and socially accepted such practices, to Lawrence, Harriet was property. Her children were property. Using them as he saw fit was simply using ownership rights, no different than working them in fields or assigning them house duties. You've treated a human being as an object for 3 decades, Pritchard said quietly. You and your father wrote down systematic rape as if recording crop yields. You passed this practice between generations like inheriting land, and you did all this with such trust in its acceptability that you openly wrote it down. Rape, Lawrence's confusion deepened. That term applies to crimes against persons. Enslaved people are property under Virginia law. By definition, what you describe cannot happen between master and property. You're applying wrong legal words to standard plantation practices, and there it was. The logic of slavery stated plainly, Lawrence was legally correct. Virginia law defined enslaved people as property, not persons. Rape laws protected white women, but didn't recognize enslaved women as victims capable of being raped. Sexual access to enslaved people was considered a property right. Lawrence hadn't committed any crime recognized by the state. The law is wrong, Pritchard said, knowing even as he spoke that he was ending his career. Hayes's face hardened. That's a political opinion, Mr. Pritchard, not a legal view. As county clerk, your role is to document property values according to existing law, not to judge the legal framework itself. Your report calls lawful conduct criminal, uses fiery language about respected citizens, and attempts to create official proof of objections that have no basis in law or rule. I documented facts stated in the Strathmore records themselves. You documented chosen facts arranged to support a political argument against slavery. This county, this state, and this nation have decided that slavery is lawful. Your personal objections don't give you power to use official reports to argue otherwise. The meeting ended with H. Ricks requiring Pritchard to hand in a changed report containing only standard property values without extra commentary. Pritchard refused. He was given a choice: submit a proper report or quit his job. He resigned that afternoon, November 2nd, 1847. His final act as county clerk was to prepare a full summary of the Strathmore documents, including long quotes from Edmund's journals and detailed timelines of Harriet's documented abuse. He handed this to the county record office as extra papers for the Strathmore property file, where it would remain unless specifically removed by officials. The clerk who received it, a young man named Thomas Wickham, read it with clear discomfort, but filed it as submitted. "What you're describing happened," Wickham asked quietly. "It's all written in their own records," Pritchard replied. "Whether anyone will care is another question." He left Boynton the following week, moving to Richmond, where he found work with a shipping company far from the plantation economy that had cost him his career for objecting to legally allowed horror. What happened after Pritchard left played out over the following months with a silence that was itself telling. Commissioner H. Ricks filed Pritchard's extra papers, but made no public statement about its contents. The county lawyer, Benjamin Hayes, advised the commissioners that the matter was finished. No legal laws had been broken. An overeager clerk had been dealt with properly, and no further action was needed or wanted. Lawrence Strathmore returned to his plantation, apparently satisfied that he'd been cleared. From his view, the entire event had been an unlucky meeting with someone who held radical views about slavery, nothing more. His books continued in the same careful style, though notably the private journals stopped. Whether this reflected increased care after the look or simply a preference for recording only business matters is unclear, but the fight had results that rippled beyond the official silence. Word spread through the county's network of planters, merchants, and officials, not about the specific details, which remained undiscussed, but about the general fact that Pritchard had objected to something in the Strathmore records, something related to enslaved people and family relationships. In a society built on unspoken agreements about what would and wouldn't be openly admitted, the break of this silence created discomfort. Martha Strathmore, Thomas's wife, learned details of the event through her husband. Her letters from December 1847 show a woman struggling with knowledge she could neither act upon nor ignore. "I have always known things happened that troubled my conscience," she wrote to her sister in Petersburg. "But I believed my awareness remained private, my discomfort my own burden. Now I learn others have seen what I saw, have written down what I chose to look away from, and have been punished for refusing to maintain our group lie. What does this make me? What does this make all of us?" The letter went unanswered. Her sister burned it unread, later explaining she couldn't bear to read complaints about matters none of us have power to change. This response was typical of the planter class's approach to uncomfortable truths: avoidance, silence, and insistence on individual helplessness that excused group guilt. Harriet's health, already fragile through the fall of 1847, got worse as winter came. The physical toll of 27 years of constant pregnancy and childbirth, combined with the stresses of enslaved housework, had worn her body beyond recovery. Martha continued to provide what care she could. Herbal remedies, soups, occasionally medicine for pain, but no one suggested seeking a doctor. Medical care for enslaved people was typically reserved for situations where property value needed protecting, and at 40 years old, having borne 12 children, Harriet represented dropping rather than growing property. The younger children, though still living in the main house or nearby, helped their mother as circumstances allowed. Ruth, now 25 and herself a mother, spent what time she could spare from her own duties sitting with Harriet. The other enslaved people on the plantation, bound by the networks of care and family that sustained survival within slavery, also provided support when possible. Food was shared, tasks moved around, small kindnesses offered within the narrow margins that slavery allowed. Harriet passed away on January 14th, 1848, 3 months after Samuel Pritchard's visit. The cause listed in plantation records was simply illness. No details, no specifics, no exam or name of disease. Her death was recorded in the same book column where her children's births had been written. Another transaction in the endless accounting of plantation property valued at $100 in the estate records, a big drop from the $600 she'd been worth at age 20. She was listed among the year's property losses along with a broken plow and a horse that had died of colic. Martha Strathmore insisted on a proper burial over Lawrence's lack of care. A plot was marked in the enslaved people's cemetery, a rough clearing beyond the plantation's main grounds where wooden markers rotted in Virginia weather. Martha arranged for a Methodist preacher to lead a brief service attended by the enslaved community, and unusually by Martha herself. No Strathmore men attended. Lawrence was in Boydton on business, and Thomas claimed illness. Their absence was noticed and noted in the quiet ways that enslaved people marked the moral failures of those who claimed power over them. The preacher, Reverend Nathan Cooper, had visited Strathmore before and knew the community. His brief speech carefully avoided specific references to Harriet's life, but his text was pointed from Exodus about the Hebrew midwives who defied Pharaoh, choosing right over obedience to evil. God sees what happens in darkness, he said, his voice carrying across the gathered mourners. God knows what the powerful choose not to admit, and God remembers those who suffered without earthly justice. The words were careful enough to avoid giving offense to any white person who might hear them, but clear enough that everyone present understood their meaning. After Harriet's burial, life on the Strathmore plantation continued its rhythms. Crops were planted and harvested. Children were born and occasionally died. Enslaved people were bought and sold as money needs dictated. Harriet's children remained on the property, their status unchanged by their mother's death. Ruth continued as a house servant. Marcus, now 13, worked in the fields, his earlier escape attempt neither forgotten nor explicitly mentioned. The younger children grew into their roles within the plantation economy, some showing abilities that made them valuable, others deemed suitable only for basic labor. Lawrence's separated wife, Elizabeth, never returned to the plantation. She remained with her family in Halifax County, raising their son Edmund in an environment purposefully distanced from Strathmore. The boy grew up knowing he had a father and an inheritance waiting for him. But Elizabeth shaped his understanding to stress duties over privileges. Letters between Elizabeth and her sister, kept in family papers, reveal her determination that Edmund would be raised with different values than those that had ruled Strathmore. "I cannot prevent him from inheriting that place," Elizabeth wrote in 1849, "but I can ensure he inherits it as a man who understands the difference between legal power and moral right. He will know that power over others is not a pass to abuse them, that property rights do not beat human dignity, and that our family's wealth was built on suffering we have a duty to admit, if not fix." Whether Elizabeth succeeded in this education remains unclear from the history books. Edmund grew to adulthood knowing his father only through occasional visits and letters. His understanding of Strathmore filtered through his mother's careful framing. The split between his parents was never made official. Divorce was difficult and scandalous, but their real separation was permanent. The Strathmore property itself changed through the 1850s as Virginia's farm economy shifted. Tobacco prices remained shaky, and Lawrence branched out into wheat and corn. Following the pattern of many Mecklenburg planters, the enslaved population grew through natural increase. Harriet's children, as they reached adulthood, had children of their own, adding to the plantation's workforce. Ruth married a man from a neighboring plantation, and Lawrence allowed the relationship because it kept her productive, and the children would be his property. The Strathmore case remained buried in county records throughout these years, the documents Samuel Pritchard had filed gathering dust in storage. Occasionally, someone doing estate research or title checks would find the records and read Pritchard's report with varying degrees of discomfort, but no action ever resulted. The system protected itself through layers of official steps and informal understanding. Everyone who might object lacked power to act, and everyone with power chose not to see. The start of the Civil War in 1861 stopped plantation operations across Virginia. Lawrence, now 53, was too old for fighting, but he gave money and supplies to the Confederate cause. The plantation gave food to military units and occasionally housed wounded soldiers. The enslaved population, aware that the war's outcome might affect their status, waited and watched and made careful calculations about loyalty and survival. Lawrence died in October 1863, aged 55, from pneumonia complications. His death came just months after the Emancipation Proclamation, though actual freedom for Strathmore's enslaved people remained unsure given Virginia's position as a Confederate state. Lawrence's will divided the property between his separated wife, Elizabeth, and their son, Edmund, now 20 years old. The paper made no specific rules for Harriet's children, who were still legally enslaved, despite Union announcements that might eventually be enforced. The end of the war in 1865 and the slow start of freedom finally freed all enslaved people on the Strathmore plantation. The change was chaotic. Legal freedom didn't automatically provide land, money, or safety. Some of Harriet's surviving children left immediately, heading north or to cities where they might build new lives with some protection from their previous masters. Others remained in the area temporarily, lacking money to move and hoping to earn wages from their former enslavers while planning eventual leaving. Ruth, the oldest, was 43 at freedom. She had spent her entire life in slavery, bearing children who themselves had been enslaved. The records don't clearly show what happened to her after 1865, though one mention in Freedmen's Bureau records from 1867 mentions a Ruth Strathmore asking for help to move to Washington, D.C. Whether this was Harriet's daughter or another woman with the same name is unclear. Marcus, who had tried to escape as a boy, left Mecklenburg County within weeks of freedom. No records trace his later path, though some evidence suggests he may have changed his name and moved west, purposely cutting all ties to his Virginia origins. For many formerly enslaved people, especially those of mixed race, whose very existence showed slavery's sexual abuse, starting completely fresh meant leaving behind even their names. The younger children scattered similarly, their fates lost to history books. The chaos of rebuilding, the purposeful destruction of Freedmen's Bureau records by white Southerners, and the general lack of interest in tracking formerly enslaved people's lives, all helped erase their stories. They survived slavery, gained legal freedom, and then disappeared into the gaps of history, their endings unknown, their voices unkept. Young Edmund Strathmore, raised by his mother with awareness of his family's moral failures, took control of the plantation in 1865. At age 22, he faced a property and economic collapse. Freedom had taken away his workforce without pay. War had destroyed markets and roads, and the plantation's value had crashed. Whether moved by his mother's teachings or simple money sense, Edmund decided not to continue plantation operations. He sold the property in 1867 to a land buyer, receiving far less than pre-war value, but enough to set himself up in Richmond. In Richmond, Edmund worked in banking and insurance, building a new career purposely disconnected from plantation farming. He married in 1870, had 3 children, and by all appearances joined Richmond's professional class. He never returned to Mecklenburg County after the sale, and his letters to his mother contain no mention of Strathmore or its history. Whether this silence reflected shame, not caring, or purposeful forgetting is impossible to say. The Strathmore plantation property passed through several owners in the late 19th century. Without enslaved labor and facing farm market trouble, it proved difficult to run profitably. The main house fell into disrepair, eventually being torn down in the 1890s. The land was split up and sold piece by piece, some parts turning back to forest, others added to smaller farms. The physical land that had held Harriet's life gradually erased, leaving only scattered foundations and overgrown cemetery plots as proof that a plantation once sat on the site. The county records remained, however. The ledgers, journals, and Samuel Pritchard's report stayed in storage through the rebuilding years and into the late 19th century. No one looked at them carefully until 1891, when a property fight among Edmund Strathmore's family required a check of the original estate documents. A lawyer named Jacob Morrison, tasked with finding clear title to some remaining Strathmore holdings, discovered Pritchard's report while researching the property history. Morrison was 53, a Virginia native who had fought for the Confederacy and built a successful law practice after the war. He approached the documents expecting routine property records, and instead found himself reading Edmund Strathmore's clear journals and Pritchard's detailed writing of what they contained. Morrison later described the experience in a letter to a friend. "I have practiced law for 25 years, handled countless estate matters involving enslaved people as property, and considered myself unsentimental about the institution we lost. But reading these records, seeing the organized nature written across generations, the clinical exactness with which one family recorded continuous sexual abuse, I found myself physically sickened in a way. Abstract discussions of slavery never affected me. Morrison's reaction revealed something significant about historical memory in the post-Reconstruction South. By 1891, the Lost Cause story had taken firm hold. Southern whites increasingly described slavery as kind, enslaved people as happy, and the pre-war period as a golden age destroyed by Northern aggression. This story required forgetting or shrinking slavery's actual nature. Morrison's meeting with the Strathmore records forced him to face writing that went against the comforting myth. Evidence that slavery enabled systematic cruelty, recorded with pride by the doers. He brought the records to the attention of the Virginia Historical Society, believing they should be kept as evidence of slavery's true nature. But the timing was poor. The 1890s marked the height of Southern white backlash against Reconstruction. The period when Jim Crow laws were being made, black voting rights systematically removed, and white supremacy reasserted through legal and illegal violence. The Historical Society refused to take the Strathmore records, with one board member explaining in private letters that such materials serve only to inflame regional tensions we must heal, and to present our region's history in unnecessarily harsh light. Morrison eventually gave the records to the Mecklenburg County Historical Society, where they were filed and largely forgotten. No book resulted, no historical study, no public admitting. The documents existed, available to anyone who specifically sought them, but effectively invisible to public mind. A few local historians looked at them over later decades, usually expressing shock at their contents, but none pursued printing or broader spreading. The Strathmore case remained what it had always been, a truth known to specific individuals, but never admitted officially or publicly. The 20th century brought new waves of historical study that gradually changed approaches to studying slavery. Early college work tended to focus on money and political aspects, treating slavery mostly as a labor system and political conflict. But by mid-century, historians increasingly looked at slavery's human sides, adding enslaved people's experiences and views. This shift created context where the Strathmore record's importance could be recognized. In 1953, a graduate student at the University of Virginia named Margaret Thornton, researching Virginia plantation records for her paper, found the Strathmore documents at the Mecklenburg County Historical Society. Thornton was studying enslaved women's experiences, and the organized writing immediately struck her as extraordinary. Most evidence of sexual abuse in slavery came from indirect sources, occasional court cases, passing references in letters, oral stories collected after freedom. The Strathmore records provided something almost unique. Clear, detailed writing by the doers themselves, kept over decades with clinical exactness. Thornton's paper, completed in 1955, included extensive study of the Strathmore case as an example of slavery's sexual abuse made visible through exceptional documentation. She traced the full timeline from Edmund's first entries through Harriet's death and the children's fates after freedom. Her work provided the first scholarly check of the case, placing it within broader patterns of enslaved women's experiences, while noting its unusual writing. The paper attracted attention from other scholars researching slavery, and parts were printed in academic journals in the late 1950s and early 1960s, but broader public awareness remained limited. Academic historical work in this period reached relatively small audiences, and discussions of slavery's sexual sides remained controversial, even in college contexts. Many white Southerners still resisted any look at slavery that challenged lost cause stories. While discussions of sexual violence remained generally taboo in public talk, the civil rights movement of the 1960s gradually created space for more honest discussion of slavery's realities as Black Americans fought for basic rights and white supremacist violence was shown on national television. The story of kind slavery became harder to keep. Historical study increasingly emphasized slavery's brutality, drawing on evidence like the Strathmore records to counter romanticized stories. By the 1970s, the Strathmore case had become somewhat better known among historians studying slavery, cited in various books and articles looking at enslaved women's experiences, but public awareness remained tiny. The records themselves stayed in Mecklenburg County, examined by occasional researchers, but never widely spread or publicly shown. Harriet's story remained primarily a college reference, known to experts, but absent from popular understanding of slavery's history. This mirrors the broader pattern of how slavery's sexual abuse has been remembered, widely known in general terms, but rarely documented in specifics discussed in abstract, but not in the detailed reality that would force genuine confrontation with what the system allowed. The Strathmore records exist as an exception to this pattern, unusually clear, systematically written, kept despite efforts at burial. Yet even with this writing, the story remained on the edge to public historical mind. The descendants of Harriet's children, scattered across the country through multiple generations of moving and name changes, likely know nothing of her story or their origins. The deliberate erasing that began with Edmund's hiding of fatherhood in early books continued through the chaos of freedom, the destruction of Freedmen's Bureau records, and the general lack of family writing for African Americans in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Family lines were broken, names were changed, and connections to Virginia origins were purposely or accidentally cut. The Strathmore land today is partly occupied by a small housing development built in the 1980s. The remaining land turning back to second growth forest. No historical marker notes what happened there. The Virginia Civil War Trails program, which has put up hundreds of markers across the state, has not put one at the Strathmore site, and local tourism papers make no mention of the plantation's history. The land itself reveals nothing of the written horrors that occurred there across the pre-war decades. The foundation of the main house remains partly visible to those who know where to look, slowly being eaten by plants and erosion. Archaeologists have not dug the site, no strong reason has emerged to justify the cost, and local pushback to examining slavery's specific realities would likely complicate such work. The Enslaved People's Cemetery, where Harriet was buried in 1848, has been lost entirely. No maintained markers remain, no clear lines define the space, and development has likely disturbed or destroyed whatever graves once existed there. This physical erasing matches the historical erasing that the Strathmore case both documents and shows. The records preserved evidence of organized sexual abuse across generations, carefully written by doers, confident in the rightness of their actions. Yet, even with this extraordinary writing, the story remains on the edge, known to specialists, occasionally cited in academic work, but absent from public memory and physical signs. This mystery shows us that truth requires more than writing. It requires public willingness to admit what the writing reveals. The Strathmore records existed in county archives for decades before anyone looked at them critically. They then existed in academic study for decades more before reaching wider awareness. Even now, most Americans remain unaware of this specific case or what it represents about slavery's systematic sexual violence. What do you think of this story? Does knowing such organized abuse was not just allowed but written down with pride change how we understand slavery's true nature? Does the keeping of these records create any duty for descendants, both black descendants of enslaved people and white descendants of enslavers, to admit and address this history? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If you found this historical account important and want to hear more stories that reveal difficult truths from America's past, please subscribe to the Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this video with others who believe we must face history honestly, no matter how disturbing. Truth. These stories matter because forgetting them allows us to believe such things could never happen when the evidence shows they did systematically, purposely, and with full legal protection. The Strathmore case isn't unique because of what happened, but because someone wrote it down so thoroughly. How many other stories remain untold because no one kept the proof? See you in the next video.